All right, so what I want to do in this video is just go over these two articles that I'm having you read this week, just to make sure you understand some of the basic things that the article is talking about. And I know, as I mentioned in the description, these are not light reading, but they're really important in terms of seeing how historians can use data to understand what was happening in the ancient world. Now, what we can do is look at this first article, Evidence for the Impact of the 8.2 kilo before present climate event on Near Eastern early farmers. And what I've done in this PDF that you can download from Blackboard is I've left a couple comments here. And so if you haven't heard of BP before, what I've done is, and you can see it here, BP just means before present. And I put another comment here saying the present, when people are talking about BP in terms of dating, is considered to be 1950. So 8.2 thousand years ago, BP would be about 6200 BC. So if you're having trouble understanding before present, you can switch it to BC or BCE, before Common Era, which would be the same. So this article is really talking about a climate event that took place, and according to the article, you can see here, let me see if this works, it took place over a span of about 160 years, and what they're talking about is you find dry and cold conditions for this period. Now, what these authors end up doing is looking at a site that we looked at last week, Çatalhöyük, in Turkey, and what they've done is they've divided up the site in these what they've just labeled as Team Paznari areas. And what they do is they look at a number of different things. So they look at fat levels, which are preserved in pottery vessels. They look at how these numbers that they're getting correspond to architectural changes, archaeozoological, that just means animal remains, and then if there are any records of what people actually ate. So what they're doing is they're trying to correspond this event that happened over 160 years with what they find at this particular site of Çatalhöyük. And then what they do is they just tell you a little bit here what they plan on doing. Now, what I'd like you to do, even before you start reading this article, is to look at the significance. So this just gives you an overview of what they are going to do. And then what I've done in this particular article, and I've done it in the second article as well, is I've highlighted some areas I want you to focus on. So here, what they start off with is that 8,200 years BP, you find something called glacial drainage of fresh water into the North Atlantic. So glaciers are melting and they're draining into the North Atlantic, and this causes weather changes, especially in Europe in particular, as well as other places. And what they do is they say this event can be measured in other places, especially in Turkey, Anatolia, and that's where Çatalhöyük is, as you know from last week. And what I've done again here, I've given you another comment where they talk about certain names like ungulates. So ungulates are animals with hooves, like cattle. And then what you can see is when you get this sudden change, what does it do to the people who are living in this area? And this is really what they are looking at. So what they've done in terms of gathering their data is they've looked at fat markers, so lipid biomarkers, which are preserved in pottery. So they take the pottery sherds, or the pottery that they find, or the pottery pieces, and they look at the fat content that can be found inside of these using their tools to get this. And so read through the significance again, and then what they do is they tell you where they're looking. So they're looking at this Team Poznan area of Çatalhöyük, and what they say here is you can see something called a long sequence of vertical stratigraphy. Think about a wall that's standing up straight. What they've done is they've dug into the ground, and you can see all these different layers. And you can see there's buildings, walls, hearths, ceramics, stone tools, human remains, plant remains, and so on. I've told you here that sherds, pot sherds, these are pieces. And as you can see here, what they're doing is their data is based on 87 potsherds, where they're looking at these fat residues that are in here. I've also defined a few other words. So it's not so important to understand. I mean, to be honest, I don't understand all of these, all of the math on here, but I can understand, and I think you can understand the descriptions of what they're talking about. So they're talking about ruminant carcass fats. So ruminants, and I just took a copy out of the dictionary: cattle, sheep, antelope, deer, giraffe, and the relatives. And then what you see, and again, you can look through these charts if you'd like to. It's not, for me, it's not the important part of the article. The important part is what I've highlighted here. And so what they show is that when they look at a whole bunch of different things, and they base this on what they call their climate modeling, they show that you do get a drier time period with not a lot of cooling, so very weak cooling. And so what they've done is they've looked at what this can possibly tell us, and it looks like a series of you get low pressures over Europe. And again, this is all related to the glacial drainage into the Atlantic and what this is doing to the weather. Down here, what I've done is, again, highlighted some different things, and let me go up to this other part. When you start reading through this, and again, caprine that they mention here are goats. So what they're looking at is they can see that this cooler weather had an impact on the animals that they were herding. So you get a decrease in cattle herd sizes and an increase in goat herds. So what they're really saying is that goats survive better in cooler weather as opposed to cattle. You also see, and I didn't highlight this, when you look at the bones, you can see butchering of the bones. And it looks like when they look at this, people are being more efficient in terms of the meat that they can actually get. And you can also see in their article, with this highlighted part, human responses are reflected in the changes in the site building architecture at this time. So as it got cooler, they started changing the way that they were living. And you can see here, one indication is that there's smaller self-efficient households that are coming out of this. And then what they've done is talked about how the livestock was impacted and what this can tell us about the way these people were living. And then the rest of the article is just on their material and methods. So I hope that makes that one a little more clear. Now let's skip to this one. Holocene fluctuations in human population demonstrate repeated links to food production and climate. And again, and I didn't highlight this, what you can do is read the significance first. Now what I've done here is, in fact I put that here, be sure to read this section too, because this is the introduction, or really the summary of what they have done. And what they're looking at is population downturns in some areas in Britain and Ireland during the late Holocene. And what they end up seeing is that these population declines are corresponding to things that they grew or did not grow. And what you can see here is, and this is sort of related to the other article, you get unstable weather, cooler weather, and this changes the way that people live here. And then in this section they talk about how they're looking at over 30,000 existing archaeological dates from British and Irish databases, and that's how they are making their study. Now let's skip down to this part. There's a couple words here that I've defined. Exogenous, and what that means is it's an outside factor. So after you've read this part, you see a boom and bust in the British Isles, and what they're talking about here is population levels. So population boom meaning the population is increasing, or population bust, meaning that the population is going down. This has sometimes been referred to, or why it happened, is that farmers are overreaching, meaning they're growing too much. That's an internal factor. An outside factor, exogenous factor, would be the weather. So that's what they're really pointing to. They think that this downturn in population is really due to weather. And they give a few things that they end up looking at here, which I've highlighted in this particular section. And then what you can do is start looking at this, this particular area. So what I've done here is pretty much summarize what they said. So the weather's getting colder, making it harder to grow food, and this causes population decline. And then you've got, by contrast, intervening episodes of climatic amelioration, and amelioration just means it's getting better. So what they're really saying is a warmer climate leads to population growth. And then what they do, and this is the fascinating part of this particular study, is they start looking at these charts here. And so, excuse me, what they do is they're talking about how these particular dates, so you're looking at this purple line, this corresponds to about 3500 BC, and then this line is close to 1000 BC, and this last purple line on the far right is about 1200, 1300 AD. And so they're looking at the numbers. So in this A, it's the number of hazelnuts. So around 3500 BC, you get a slight increase in the number of hazelnuts that are being grown. Now if you go down to here, you see in wheat, you get a sharp decline of the amount of wheat. And then here, if you look at barley, oats, and legumes, you see an increase. And then with animals, you see a slight increase. And they break down which kind of animals that they're talking about in the article. But then what this does, this written part just describes these charts. So make sure you look at these charts and sort of understand what they're really talking about. And what you can see here in their conclusions is that there are 3 episodes of population downturn, and that in Britain and Ireland you've got different responses for that. And it looks like what's happening is that you've got climate factors that are affecting human population. And as I put here, you can stop reading at this point, because you can certainly read more on the material and methods and how they collected everything, and then of course they've got a giant bibliography in case you want to look up any of this. So one of the main reasons why I'm having you read these articles is, again, to show that historians can use hard data, hard numbers, to explain what might be happening in the ancient past. Now I've set up a discussion board if anyone wants